All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about queries in Helix. And this is kind of an outside data channel inside Helix that it's not particularly well used yet, but could be quite useful for different applications and some different purposes. So we'll dive right in. The problem that queries are meant to solve is that sometimes a federate needs some kind of metadata about a federate or federation. It needs kind of some information to know how to set itself up, or just kind of understanding of what's going on with the entire federation. And this is often out of band with normal data transfer, so there's no consistent linkages, there's no dependencies created, and there's no time ordering to these individual kind of requests. But sometimes this information is necessary to set up a federation itself, so it has to be outside of kind of normal state machine of the federation and of Helix. And so this can be used for a delayed setup where one federate is dependent on information from another, so it knows how to set itself up. For instance, an observer may need to know what publications a federate has, or just general monitoring purposes, or just general metadata information. And so queries were designed as a way to address some of these potential issues when creating co-simulations and setups. And they're basically an asynchronous question asking mechanism. They consist of a target, which is who you're directing a query to, and a property or a string. And then it responds with a string of information. The way it works is you send a query to a federate, for example. It basically does some logic inside to figure out if it knows the answer already, and if it does, it just returns it. If not, it sends the query upward to the core and so on to a broker, and that can search through to find who would know the answer to the question being asked. And the original asker of the query is then blocked until the answer is generated and sent back to the originator. And so it's basically a series of, do I know the answer to this question? Yes, generate it and send it back. If not, send it to someone who might know. There's a number of different types of targets that can be used. You can query a core, a broker, the root broker, such as that's the central coordinator object for Helix. You can query the federation as a whole, and all of these different objects have individual names that can also be used as a target. So you can send a query to a specific federate if you know that federate exists, or you can query its existence. Some of the types of queries that are available are you can query all the publications, endpoints, whether it exists or not, whether it's initialized, what state it's in, and then the time dependencies and dependent information. For cores and brokers, you can also query all the federates, and for brokers, you can also query all the brokers that are part of it. There's others that are being added, and if there's more types of information that may be available, I'd be interested in knowing what people might want to use this for as well. The response that you get is there's an invalid string if the query is unrecognized. You have something that nobody knows how to compute. There's valid responses are just a single string, so it may be true if something exists, false if it doesn't, or some string representing the state of something. It can respond with a vector of strings. For instance, if you ask for the publications of a particular federate, you will get a vector of strings, which is essentially double quotes and a bracket and strings separated by a semicolon. And some other types of queries respond with a JSON string and a more complex object. What's on the screen now is kind of a list of the actual function calls as part of the C++ interface. You can generate a query with the target and the query string, or if you just want to query the current object, you don't need to specify the target. Those two calls will be blocking calls. So it will not give control back and return from the function unless it can answer the query. There's also an asynchronous version of this as well. So if you call the query async, it'll return immediately with a query ID. and then you can query and you can ask if the query has completed or complete the query. And this is very similar to the asynchronous non-blocking function calls for the other blocking calls inside Helix. There are correspondent calls in the C API. The main distinction here is that you create a query before calling it. So you create it with a target and a query string, and then you use this query object to make the other calls. So you can execute that as part of a federate, call the asynchronous version, and then the completion and is completed function. And then there's also a query free when you no longer need it. This way you can actually execute a query multiple times. There's a couple helper functions available in the library. These are mainly for dealing with vectors of strings. So you can split the string into a vector and then sort it if you want. And then a couple helper functions for a few use cases. For instance, waiting for another federate to be initialized, so you know that federate has finished its initialization process and is ready to and has completed all the publications it has available. So you call wait for init, and then when it returns true, you know the federate you're querying has been initialized. And there's also a wait for federate, so you can wait for that federate to actually join. And what you're doing in this case is you're starting from a single federate, and then you're in the federate name here, you're asking for another federate of the one you want to wait for. For the future of this, we're working on ways to generate a system dependency map, so you can actually make a query from any point in the system and get a full map of what the federation actually looks like at a given point in time, and possibly doing the same thing with a routing map. We want to add query functions directly on cores or brokers. Right now you can only direct that through an existing federate, but it may make sense to be able to query directly cores and brokers. And then this is still kind of in the early stage of how it might be useful, so we're interested in what other types of queries may we want and what might this be useful for. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, with no questions, thank you, Phil.